Hi, welcome to OWTV. You're watching Off the Bench with Josh. I'm Joshua Gable, and we're going to dive into Week 6 of the NFL with highlight scores and team updates. Thursday, October 14th, Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers took on Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles. In that game, Tom Brady was 34 for 42 with 297 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Leading rusher Leonard Fournette was 81 yards for 2 touchdowns on 22 attempts. And Antonio Brown had 93 yards receiving with 1 touchdown on 9 receptions. Jalen Hurts went 12 for 26, 115 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. He also led rushing with 44 yards on 10 attempts for 2 touchdowns. Zach Ertz was the leading receiver with 4 receptions for 29 yards and 1 touchdown. Important to note, Zach Ertz was also traded from the Philadelphia Eagles to the Arizona Cardinals for cornerback Ted Galvin and a 2022 fifth-round draft pick. In that game, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers won 28-22, bringing their record to 5-1, and the Philadelphia Eagles' records to 2-4. Now I'm going to take you guys to Sunday's matchups. First game, we have Dolphins versus the Jaguars. Tua Tagovailoa for the Dolphins was 33 out of 47 with 329 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Leading rusher Malcolm Brown had 5 rushes for 24 yards. Leading receiver Mike Gesicki, tight end, had 8 receptions for 115 yards. But rookie Jalen Waddle stepped in for Devin Parker, who's out with a shoulder injury right now, and had 10 receptions for 70 yards and 2 touchdowns. So a great game for him, stepping in for an injury. Then for the Jaguars, Trevor Lawrence was 25 for 41 with 319 yards and 1 touchdown. James Robinson was the leading rusher for the Jaguars with 17 carries for 73 yards and 1 touchdown. And the leading receiver for the Jaguars was Marvin Jones, who had 7 receptions, 100 yards, and 1 touchdown. But Laviska Shenault Jr. made the best play of the game, and he had 6 receptions for 54 yards. But what he did at the end of the game is why I think he had the play of the game. On that drive, he ran a slant route where it was caught for a pass, putting them in field goal range to beat the Miami Dolphins 23-21. That brings their record to 1-5, and the Miami Dolphins record to 1-5 as well. Our next matchup, the Houston Texans versus the Indianapolis Colts. Davis Mills for the Houston Texans, 29-43, with 243 yards passing and 2 interceptions. Leading rusher was Mark Ingram with 18 carries for 73 yards, and the leading receiver, Brandon Cooks, 9 receptions and 89 yards. For the Indianapolis Colts, Carson Wentz was 11 out of 20 with 223 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. Leading rusher was Jonathan Taylor, who had a great game with 14 carries for 145 yards and 2 touchdowns. T.Y. Hilton also made his debut back after suffering an injury. He had 4 receptions for 80 yards before he left with a quad injury. Also important to note that following this game, the Texans cut longtime player Whitney Mercilus, which was a mutual agreement and understanding by both parties. And he had a very great career with the Texans. The Texans end up falling 31-3 against the Colts, bringing their record to 1-5 and the Colts record to 2-4. Our next matchup, Green Bay Packers versus the Chicago Bears. Aaron Rodgers was 17 for 23 with 195 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. Aaron Jones, the leading rusher, had 13 carries for 76 yards, and the leading receiver, Devontae Adams, had 4 receptions for 89 yards. Justin Fields for the Chicago Bears, 16 out of 27 with 174 yards passing, 1 touchdown and 1 interception. Leading rusher, Khalil Herbert, who's taking over for Damian Williams, who tested positive for COVID-19, had a good game with 19 carries for 97 yards and 1 touchdown. And Allen Robinson, the leading receiver, 4 receptions for 53 yards. The Green Bay Packers end up taking that game 24-14, bringing their record to 5-1, and the Chicago Bears records to 3-3. Our next matchup is the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Detroit Lions. For the Bengals, Joe Burrow was 19-29 with 271 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Joe Mixon led in carries with 18 for 94 yards, and Jamar Chase led in receptions with 4 for 97 yards. For the Detroit Lions, Jared Goff was 28-42 with 202 yards passing and 1 interception. DeAndre Swift had 13 carries for 24 yards and a touchdown, and tight end TJ Hawkinson had 8 receptions for 74 yards. Following the game, Dan Campbell said that Jared Goff needed to step up and put the weight on his shoulders and help the team get wins. Very big words for rookie head coach Dan Campbell, but nonetheless, the Bengals end up beating the Lions 34-11, bringing their record to 4-2, and the Lions still winless 0-6. Our next matchup is the Los Angeles Rams versus the New York Giants. Matthew Stafford for the Rams was 22 out of 28 with 251 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Darrell Henderson had 21 carries for 78 yards and 1 touchdown, and Cooper Kupp had 9 receptions for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns. Daniel Jones for the Giants, 29 out of 51 with 242 yards and 3 interceptions. Just a week after suffering a concussion, some might say they brought him in too quickly. Devin Booker had 12 carries for 41 yards, who's taking over for the injured Saquon Barkley, and Sterling Shepard, 10 receptions for 76 yards. Important to note that Kadarius Toney left with an ankle injury, a team that has been hammered with injuries already. So with that unfortunate news, that just adds to the total of injuries. The Rams end up beating the Giants 38-11, bringing the Rams record to 5-1 and the New York Giants record to 1-5. Our next matchup is the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Washington Football Team. Patrick Mahomes for the Chiefs was 32 out of 47 with 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Darrell Williams had 21 carries for 62 yards and 2 touchdowns, taking over for the injured Edwards-Helaire. And Travis Kelce had 8 receptions for 99 yards. For the football team, Taylor Heinicke was 24 out of 39 with 182 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. J.D. McKissick, 8 carries for 45 yards. He also had 8 receptions for 65 yards. In that game, the Kansas City Chiefs were able to beat the Washington Football Team 31-13, bringing the Chiefs record to 3-3 and the football team record to 2-4. Our next matchup, Minnesota Vikings versus the Carolina Panthers. Kirk Cousins for the Vikings, 33 out of 48 with 373 yards passing and 3 touchdowns. Dalvin Cook had 29 carries for 140 yards and 1 touchdown. Adam Thielen had 11 receptions for 126 yards. For the Panthers, Sam Darnold was 17 out of 41 with 207 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Rushing, you had Chuba Hubbard, 16 carries for 61 yards and a touchdown. And DJ Moore, 5 receptions for 73 yards. Christian McCaffrey, who would be their leading rusher, is out on injured reserve right now, which is why Chuba Hubbard stepped in. In that game, it came down to the wire, where the Vikings was able to beat the Panthers in overtime, 34-28, with Kirk Cousins finding KJ Osborne for the game winner, bringing the Vikings record to 3-3 and the Panthers record to 3-3. Our next matchup is the Los Angeles Chargers versus the Baltimore Ravens. For the Chargers, Justin Herbert was 22 out of 39 with 195 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. The Chargers couldn't seem to find any running room in that game, as Justin Herbert also led rushing with just 2 carries for 12 yards. Keenan Allen had 5 receptions for 50 yards. For the Baltimore Ravens, Lamar Jackson, 19 for 20 out of 27 with 167 yards with 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. Devonta Freeman had 9 carries for 53 yards, and tight end Mark Andrews had 5 receptions for 68 yards and 1 touchdown. The Baltimore Ravens were able to beat the Los Angeles Chargers 34-6, bringing the Chargers record to 4-2 and the Ravens record to 5-1. Our next matchup is the Arizona Cardinals versus the Cleveland Browns. Kyler Murray was 20 out of 30 for 229 yards passing and 4 touchdowns. James Conner had 16 carries for 71 yards, and AJ Green had 5 receptions for 79 yards. Baker Mayfield, 19 out of 28 with 234 yards passing, and 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. Kareem Hunt had 14 carries for 66 yards, and Donovan Peoples-Jones had 4 receptions for 101 yards and 2 touchdowns. Baker Mayfield re-injured his shoulder in that game and has a torn labrum, and Kareem Hunt left the game with a calf injury, and the Browns are out both stud running backs Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Baker Mayfield still has a possibility to play next week, but the Browns ended up losing 37-14, and the Cardinals moved to 6-0, and the Browns moved to 3-3. Our next matchup is the Denver Broncos versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Derek Carr for the Raiders, 18 out of 27 with 341 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. Josh Jacobs had 16 carries for 53 yards and 1 touchdown. And Henry Ruggs III had 3 receptions for 97 yards and 1 touchdown. Teddy Bridgewater, 35 out of 49 with 334 yards passing with 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Javonte Williams had 11 carries for 53 yards, and Noah Fant, the tight end, had 9 receptions for 97 yards and 1 touchdown. Even after the resigning of John Gruden, that did not affect the Las Vegas Raiders' chemistry, or it did not drift their importance on the game, with them winning 34-24, bringing their record to 4-2 and the Denver Broncos record to 3-3. Our next matchup is the Dallas Cowboys versus New England Patriots. Dak Prescott was 36 out of 51 with 445 yards passing with 3 touchdowns and 1 interception. Ezekiel Elliott had 17 carries for 69 yards, and CeeDee Lamb had 9 receptions for 149 yards and 2 touchdowns. Mac Jones, the rookie, was 15 out of 21 with 229 yards passing, 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. Damian Harris had a great rushing game. He had 18 carries for 101 yards and 1 touchdown. Kendrick Bourne also had a great game with 1 reception for 75 yards that went for a touchdown. The game ended up going into overtime, but with Dak finding his connection to CeeDee Lamb, he was able to get the win, making the Cowboys win 35-29, bringing their record to 5-1 and the New England Patriots record to 2-4. For our last matchup of Week 6 is the Buffalo Bills versus the Tennessee Titans. Josh Allen was 35 out of 47 with 353 yards passing, 3 touchdowns and 1 interception. Devin Singletary had 5 carries for 27 yards, and Emmanuel Sanders had 5 receptions for 91 yards. Ryan Tannehill was 18 out of 29 with 216 yards and 1 interception. Derrick Henry had a monster game, though, with 20 carries for 143 yards and 3 touchdowns. And A.J. Brown, who played through an illness, had 7 receptions for 91 yards. The Tennessee Titans end up beating the Buffalo Bills 34-31, bringing both teams to a record of 4-2. That does it for Week 6 game updates. Tune in next week